The morning sun painted our kitchen in shades of amber as I sat at the worn wooden table, excitement bubbling in my chest. Today was the day Dad would assign harvest duties, and I'd been waiting for this moment all summer. At 19, I finally felt ready to prove myself worthy of joining the family's most important season. Dad cleared his throat, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "All right, everyone, listen up. Harvest starts Monday." My older brother Marcus leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk already forming on his lips. Sarah, my twin sister, fidgeted with her napkin, avoiding eye contact. "Marcus, you'll handle the combine operation on the North Fields. Sarah, you're on grain transport with the trucks." Dad's voice carried the authority of 30 years farming this land. My heart raced as I waited for my assignment. The silence stretched longer than it should have. I watched Dad's face, searching for any sign of what role I'd play in our family's legacy. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second feeling like an eternity. "What about me, Dad?" I finally asked, my voice smaller than I'd intended. Dad exchanged a glance with Marcus, and I saw something pass between them that made my stomach clench. This wasn't going according to plan. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment playing out in my mind countless times over the past month. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table, wearing that expression he'd perfected since childhood, the one that said he knew something I didn't. "Look, little brother," he began, and I already hated where this was heading. "Harvest isn't like the little chores you've been doing around here." Little chores. The words stung more than they should have. I'd spent every summer since I turned 16 working these fields, learning every inch of our family's 800 acres. "You're too slow for real farm work," Marcus continued, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. "We can't afford to have someone holding us back when we've got deadlines to meet." Dad nodded slowly, and I felt something crack inside my chest. "Your brother's right, son. Harvest is about timing and efficiency. Maybe next year, when you've had more experience." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes filled with what might have been pity. "You could help Mom with the bookkeeping," she offered weakly. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Bookkeeping. While my family worked the land that had been in our name for 3 generations, I'd be sitting inside, pushing papers around. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who spent more time in these fields than anyone else would be the only one not harvesting them. The days that followed felt surreal, like watching my life through someone else's eyes. I'd wake before dawn, dress in my work clothes, and then remember I had nowhere to go. The sound of equipment starting up in the distance became a constant reminder of my exclusion. Mom tried to soften the blow by keeping me busy with indoor tasks, but every ledger entry felt like a small betrayal of who I was. Through the office window, I watched Marcus commanding the combine like he was born to it, while Sarah expertly maneuvered the grain trucks along routes I could navigate blindfolded. The neighboring farmers began stopping by, as they always did during harvest. Old Pete Morrison asked where I was, and I heard Dad explain that I was learning the business side this year. The euphemism made my skin crawl. "That boy knows these fields better than most grown men," Pete had said, and for a moment I felt vindicated. But Dad just chuckled and changed the subject. Friends from high school called asking when I'd be free to hang out. How could I explain that I was free all the time because my own family didn't think I was capable of doing the work I'd been preparing for my entire life? The shame was suffocating. I began taking long walks in the evenings, following the perimeter of our property, my hands trailing through crops I'd helped plant and tend. The wheat whispered secrets I felt I'd never be trusted to hear. 3 days into harvest season, I was checking fence posts along our eastern border when I heard the familiar rumble of old Pete Morrison's truck. He pulled up beside me, dust settling around his worn boots as he climbed out. "You look like a man with time on his hands," he said, his keen eyes studying my face. I shrugged, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Pete had known me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and he had a way of seeing through pretenses. "Funny thing," he continued, leaning against his truck. "My grandson Jake was supposed to help with my harvest, but he got himself a job in the city. Left me short-handed right when I need all the help I can get." The implication hung between us. Pete's farm bordered ours to the east, 400 acres of prime farmland that he'd been working since before I was born. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering opportunity. "I know what you're thinking," Pete said before I could respond. "What would your daddy say? But seems to me a young man needs to make his own way in the world sometimes." My heart hammered against my ribs. This could be my chance to prove myself, to show that I belonged in the fields during harvest season. But it would mean going against my family's decision, stepping out on my own in a way I'd never done before. "I pay fair wages," Pete added quietly, "and I teach what I know to folks willing to learn." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Pete's offer echoing in my mind. Through my bedroom window, I could see the lights of our own harvest operation working the night shift. Marcus would be out there, probably telling anyone who'd listen how he was carrying the family operation on his shoulders. By morning, my decision was made. I found Pete fixing a hydraulic line on his combine, his hands black with grease, but his movements precise and confident. "If the offer's still good, I'd like to take you up on it," I said. Pete straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Course it's still good. But you sure about this? Your family's not going to be happy." "They've made it clear they don't need me," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Pete nodded slowly. "All right then. We start tomorrow at 5 a.m. Bring work gloves, and a willingness to learn things might be done different than you're used to." As I walked home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: purpose. Whatever happened, I wouldn't spend another harvest season watching from the sidelines. I was going to work the land, even if it wasn't the land I'd expected. The conversation with my parents that evening was tense. Dad's jaw tightened when I told him about Pete's offer, and Mom looked worried. But I was 19 years old, and legally, the decision was mine to make. "Don't come crying to us when Morrison works you too hard," Marcus said, but I caught something else in his voice. Was that concern? Pete's alarm system was the rooster that lived in his barn, and it went off promptly at 4:30 a.m. I'd barely slept, but adrenaline carried me through the morning routine. By the time I arrived at Pete's farm, he already had coffee brewing and was checking the weather on his phone. "Looks like we've got 3 good days before the next rain system," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "We'll need to make them count." Pete's operation was smaller than ours, but everything was immaculately maintained. His combine was older, but ran like a Swiss watch, and he knew every bolt and belt by heart. He started by showing me how he liked his grain hoppers cleaned, explaining the logic behind each step. "Your daddy's got good instincts," Pete said as we worked. "But he's got blind spots too, like all of us. Sometimes being too close to something makes it hard to see clearly." The first field we tackled was a 40-acre plot of wheat that stood golden and ready. Pete let me handle the grain cart while he operated the combine, teaching me the rhythm of harvest, the dance between cutting and hauling that had to be perfectly timed. By noon, I was covered in grain dust and chaff, my arms aching from wrestling with the heavy equipment. But I was grinning like a fool. This was exactly where I belonged. "You've got good instincts," Pete said during our lunch break, "and you listen. That's rarer than you might think." The second day with Pete, everything began to click. The morning started with me arriving 15 minutes early, eager to begin. Pete noticed and nodded approvingly as he handed me the coffee that was becoming our ritual. "Today you drive the combine," he announced. My hands trembled slightly as I climbed into the operator's seat. This machine was worth more than most people's houses, and Pete was trusting me with it. The weight of responsibility felt good. different from the weight of exclusion I'd carried at home. Pete rode alongside, offering guidance but never taking control. When I made a mistake, cutting too fast in a corner and spilling grain, he simply showed me how to adjust. No lectures, no disappointment, just patient instruction. Every farmer's got to learn from his own mistakes, he said. The key is making sure they're small ones while you're learning. By afternoon, I was operating independently while Pete handled the grain cart. The rhythm of harvest was becoming second nature. Reading the crop, adjusting speed, watching for changes in grain moisture. This was the education my family had decided I wasn't ready for. During our dinner break, Pete shared stories of harvests past, including the year my grandfather had helped him save his crop when his own combine broke down. "Family farms look out for each other," he said. "Sometimes that means looking beyond your own family." The words carried more weight than he probably intended. On my fourth day working for Pete, we encountered our first real crisis. The weather forecast had changed overnight. The rain system was moving in a day early, and we had 120 acres of wheat that would be ruined if it got soaked. "We need to work through the night," Pete said, studying the darkening sky. "Can you handle it?" I thought about Marcus's words, too slow for real farm work, and felt determination surge through me. Whatever it takes. Pete made some phone calls, arranging for additional grain trucks from other neighbors. Soon, we had a convoy of equipment working his fields like a well-orchestrated symphony. I stayed in the combine, pushing the machine to its limits while maintaining the quality Pete demanded. Around midnight, exhaustion began creeping in, but I fought it off. This was my chance to prove I belonged in the harvest fields. Every swath cut was a statement. Every hopper filled was evidence against the doubts my family had voiced. Pete worked alongside me, never complaining, never showing fatigue despite being 30 years my senior. When I stumbled getting out of the cab for a quick break, he steadied me without comment. "Your grandfather had that same stubborn streak," he said. "Served him well most of the time." By dawn, we'd saved every acre. As the first drops of rain began falling, our last truck was pulling away from the field, loaded with grain that would have been lost if not for our overnight push. Word of our successful overnight harvest spread through the farming community faster than news usually traveled. By the time I got home that morning, still covered in chaff and running on pure adrenaline, Dad was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Heard you and Pete pulled an all-nighter," he said. I nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "We got it all in before the rain." Dad was quiet for a long moment, studying his coffee cup. "Pete called this morning, said you handled that combine like you were born to it." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe even pride. Also said he's never had a worker show up early every single day, ready to learn whatever needed learning. The words should have felt like vindication, but instead, they felt bittersweet. Why did it take Pete Morrison's validation for my own father to see what had been in front of him all along? Marcus appeared in the doorway, still in his sleep clothes. "Is it true? About the overnight harvest?" "Every word," Dad confirmed. 120 acres cut and hauled before the storm hit. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in Marcus's eyes when he looked at me. The dynamic between us was shifting and we both felt it. "Pete's paying him too," Dad added, and I caught the note of surprise in his voice. That afternoon, as I was preparing to head back to Pete's farm, Dad intercepted me by the truck. "How about you take a day off from Morrison's place?" he suggested. "We could use an extra hand in the south fields." The invitation I'd waited for all summer was finally being extended, but the timing felt wrong. Pete was counting on me, and I'd given him my word. More importantly, I was discovering something about myself working his fields, confidence I'd never known I possessed. "I can't leave Pete short-handed," I replied. He's depending on me. Dad's eyebrows raised slightly. This was probably the first time I'd ever turned down a chance to work our family's land. Morrison will understand. Family comes first. It would have been nice if family had come first when harvest assignments were being made, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken dynamics. Dad looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just nodded. Pete's got a good reputation as a teacher, he said quietly. Maybe you're learning things there you wouldn't learn here. It was the closest thing to an admission I was likely to get. As I drove toward Pete's farm, I realized that earning my place in our family's operation was going to require more than just proving I could do the work. It was going to require changing how they saw me entirely. Pete's farm became my classroom over the following days. He taught me to read weather patterns, to judge grain moisture by feel, to diagnose equipment problems by sound. More importantly, he taught me to trust my instincts and make decisions under pressure. When a hydraulic line burst on the combine during a critical afternoon, I found myself crawling under the machine with tools, making repairs I'd only watched others perform. Pete supervised, but let me work through the problem myself. "You've got good hands," he said as I tightened the final fitting, "and a good head for troubleshooting." The repair held, and we finished the field that evening without losing time. As we cleaned up, Pete made a comment that stayed with me. Some folks are born knowing their place in the world. Others have to go find it. That night, a severe thunderstorm rolled through, bringing hail that had every farmer in the county holding their breath. Pete and I spent the worst of it in his barn, listening to ice pellets hammer the metal roof and praying they weren't large enough to damage the standing crop. When morning came, we walked the fields together, assessing the damage. Some of the wheat was beaten down but still harvestable. Other sections would need to be written off entirely. Pete's face was grim as he calculated losses, but he never complained or showed despair. "Weather's part of farming," he said simply. "You learn to roll with it." That pragmatic acceptance of circumstances beyond our control was another lesson I filed away for future use. 2 weeks into my employment with Pete, I experienced what he called the moment. That point when farming stops being a series of tasks and becomes an intuitive understanding of land, weather, and crops working together. It happened while I was combining a field of barley that had been challenging all morning. The grain moisture was variable, the terrain was uneven, and I'd been struggling to maintain consistent quality. Then, suddenly, everything clicked. I could feel the machine's rhythm, sense when the crop was feeding properly, adjust for changes in conditions without conscious thought. The combine became an extension of myself, responding to subtle inputs I wasn't even aware I was making. Pete noticed immediately. "There it is," he said over the radio. "Now you're farming instead of just operating equipment." The feeling was intoxicating, like discovering a talent I'd always possessed but never fully accessed. This was what I'd been missing in all those years of doing farm chores. I'd been working on the farm, but I hadn't been truly farming. That evening, Pete opened 2 beers and we sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint his fields gold and crimson. "Your daddy's going to want you back," he said quietly. "He'd be a fool not to." I'm not sure I want to go back," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty. Pete nodded knowingly. "Sometimes a man's got to leave home to find out what home means to him." The conversation I'd been avoiding finally came 3 weeks into my work with Pete. Dad drove up to Morrison's farm just as we were finishing the day's combining, his truck throwing dust as he parked beside our grain cart. He climbed out slowly, surveying our operation with the practiced eye of a lifelong farmer. Pete greeted him cordially. These men had been neighbors for decades, after all, but there was tension in the air. "Mind if I have a word with my son?" Dad asked. Pete nodded and diplomatically found reasons to check equipment on the far side of the field. Dad and I stood in the growing twilight, neither of us quite sure how to begin this conversation. "Marcus broke down yesterday," Dad said finally. "Transmission went out on the big combine. We're behind schedule." I waited, sensing there was more coming. "Pete says you've got a real feel for this work, says you're the best seasonal hand he's had in years." Dad's voice carried something I'd never heard before, a kind of wondering respect. "I like working for Pete," I said carefully. "I know you do, and I'm starting to understand why." Dad kicked at a clod of dirt, gathering his thoughts. "Your brother's good with machinery, always has been. But watching isn't the same as understanding, and understanding isn't the same as whatever it is you've found here." He looked directly at me then. "I made a mistake. We made a mistake. You belong in those fields, maybe more than any of us." The apology I'd wanted for weeks felt different now that it was being offered. I'd changed during my time with Pete, grown into a confidence that didn't require external validation. "What are you asking, Dad?" "Come home. Help us finish harvest. Be part of the family operation, the way you should have been from the beginning." The decision to return home wasn't immediate. Pete and I discussed it over coffee the next morning, sitting in his kitchen as dawn broke over fields we'd worked together. "You've got a choice to make," he said. "You could stay here, learn my operation, maybe take it over someday when I'm ready to retire, or you can go back and change how things work in your family." "What would you do?" I asked. Pete smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "I'd go home, but I'd go home different than I left." He was right. I was different. The skills I'd learned, the confidence I'd gained, the respect I'd earned, these weren't things that could be taken away. I was no longer the uncertain young man who'd been deemed too slow for real farm work. I finished Pete's harvest first. Loyalty demanded that much. We brought in his final field on a perfect autumn afternoon, the grain golden and the sky cloudless. As we shut down the combine for the last time, Pete handed me an envelope. "Your wages, plus a bonus," he said. "You earned every penny." But the money, while appreciated, wasn't the real payment. The real payment was the transformation I'd undergone, the farmer I'd become. When I returned to our family farm, I brought Pete's teachings with me. Dad put me in charge of the South Fields, and I applied everything I'd learned about reading crops, managing equipment, and making decisions under pressure. The results spoke for themselves. Marcus and I worked side by side, our relationship subtly altered by the respect I'd earned outside our family circle. Sarah began asking my opinion on grain handling techniques. Most importantly, Dad started including me in discussions about next year's planting strategy. As our harvest drew to a close, I stood in the final field to be cut, the same field where I'd walked alone on those first painful evenings of exclusion. The wheat whispered the same secrets, but now I was trusted to hear them. The combine I operated now bore our family name, but the skills that guided it had been earned in another man's fields. Sometimes you have to leave home to discover who you really are. Sometimes you have to prove yourself to strangers before your family can see you clearly. But in the end, the land doesn't care about family dynamics or hurt feelings. The land only cares about who understands its needs, who can read its signals, who can harvest its gifts with skill and respect. I had become that person, and the harvest was proof. Thank you for listening to this story of finding your place, earning respect, and discovering that sometimes the path home leads through someone else's fields. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and if you have your own story of proving yourself when others doubted you. If you enjoyed this tale of perseverance and family, please subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming challenges and finding your true calling. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by others' expectations. It's proven by your own determination to succeed. Keep growing, keep learning, and keep believing in yourself.